Well, thank you everyone for coming. My name is Michael Che. I'm the Department of Political Sciences chair, I guess, the chairperson. I just started in July. And we're really, really excited for you to be here. And we're really excited to hear the lecture by Larissa MacFarquhar. And I just wanted to say a few words first about this event. I came here with my wife in 2001. I came to the UCLA Political Science Department. Our kids were 6 and 4. And now they're all grown. And I really are very, very grateful for being able to be part of the Department of Political Science at UCLA. It was a great scholarly home. It continues to be a great scholarly institution, and it's been a great personal home for me. And obviously that would not exist without people like yourselves who support the department, and it would not exist without our 4 runners in the department, including Jack Bollens, Chuck Rees, and Marv Hoffenberg. So I really think it's very fortunate and grateful. I'm very happy that we were able to spend this evening tonight to honor these folks. So I just wanted to speak a little bit about them. I mean, John C. Bollens, Jack Bollens, he served on the UCLA faculty from 1950 to 1983. And I got one of his books from the library today. And what's interesting is actually all 3 of these people wrote on stuff which is related to Larissa's lecture, in the sense that they wrote on regional politics and local issues. So, for example, this is a book called The Metropolis. It was written by John Bollens and Henry Schmant, and it actually had several editions from the 60s to 1980, which is very impressive, and it was used as a textbook in hundreds of universities. And so I'll just read a little bit from it. This is from the last edition in 1980. As the nation proceeds into the 1980s, many of the trends of the last decade have become more pronounced. Energy costs continue to escalate, industrial productivity shows little improvement, and the fiscal woes of the cities offer no signs of abatement. Contributing to the urban predicament are the tax rebellion, economic recession, regional population shifts, and the swing toward political conservatism, so dramatically evidenced in the 1980 presidential election, which was run by a Californian, if you remember. Symbolic of the current era are Proposition 13 and other tax limitation measures, double-digit inflation, record interest rates, the moral majority, the near-nuclear disaster at 3 Mile Island, the crisis of bailout by government, the revival of the Ku Klux Klan, acts of random violence, and single-issue politics. It is within this troubled setting that cities and metropolitan areas operate. So what's interesting is when I read this, we're definitely living the results of those trends. It's very obvious, right? And those trends have been very, very influential and important in how we live. So John C. Rees, Chuck Rees, he actually received his PhD from UCLA in 1962. He served on the UCLA faculty from 1965 to 1987. And he wrote a book called How Cities Provide Services, an Evaluation of Alternative Delivery Structures, with Sidney Sonnenblum and John J. Curlin. So obviously one of the issues in a person deciding whether to leave their hometown or stay has to do with the public services. And they write, for example, the wealthier the city, the higher its expenditures, and the more likely it is to provide services through city departments, thereby maintaining complete control of service quality. The less affluent cities have smaller city budgets. These cities also happen to be the ones which contract for more of their services. So it is true that during this period we have seen a very great change in how city services and social services have been delivered, and Chuck Rees and co-author wrote about this a long time ago, in 1977. Marvin Hoffenberg, he wrote a report called Influence of National Decisions on Regional Economics with Eugene J. Devine, and it was one of these reports, and these are some example reports. This is how reports were done before the World Wide Web existed. And so his particular report was not in the library because somebody had checked it out and was reading it. So, but again, he was also a noted scholar of how economies change regional development, which is also a very important part of the story, I think, which Larissa will talk about. So I just also want to take a moment to talk and acknowledge and thank the members of the Bollens family, the Rees family, and the Hoffenberg family and their representatives. So I just wanted to thank you for that. And, I wanted to thank the Executive Committee and Honorary Committee of the Bollens-Ries-Hoffenberg Lecture with John Garagosian as chair. Thank you so much. Thank you. And I appreciate everyone coming out tonight, and thank you again so much for your support for the department. And I'm going to ask Davide Panagia, my colleague, to introduce Larissa. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for coming, everyone, and thank you, Larissa, for joining us. It's great that you're able to reschedule and be able to be here in the fall. I've known Larissa, no, I'm not going to. I remember when I first met Larissa, I was in graduate school, and she walked into a pub where a bunch of us were sitting, sat down, joined us. We had a friend in common, and immediately became the center of attention. Not because of demanding that attention, but because the moment in which she started talking, we were all fascinated by the ways in which she was able to articulate her ideas about the world and about one another in a manner that was so easily and readily available to everyone in their own way. And I think that that's one of the things that I find most remarkable about Larissa's work. At the time, she was already writing for the now defunct Lingua Franca, and she was an advisor editor for the Paris Review. This was in her early 20s, and then decided madly, against everybody's advice, to leave her PhD program and become a writer for The New Yorker. God forbid that any of my students would decide to do that. The reason why I'm talking about her in this way is because one of the things that I find incredibly impressive about her writing to this day is the ways in which her biographies allow us to enter the lives of people in unique and determined sorts of ways. She opens up these people without exposing them. She invites us into their lives and makes us pay attention not just to their ideas, but most importantly, to what drives their ideas, to their passions, and to their most deeply held beliefs and convictions. And this is one of the things that I found is most, I think, not just compelling, but exciting about her book, Strangers Drowning, that was published a couple of years ago. It's a unique book because it talks about people who most of us would have a hard time with, which is the really zealous do-gooders, people who really, really make sacrifices against all odds and against the benefits, mostly of people that we would care about, in order to try to help as many people. They are the people that, in our world, are going to be really, really difficult to sustain because, as you know, they're the ones who have chosen not to, in the famous example that she begins her book with, not to save their mothers, but to save the other two people who are drowning rather than their mother. This is the example of Strangers Drowning. And I'm saying that it's becoming more and more difficult because, as we know, self-driving cars are dealing with exactly this problem of, or what philosophers call the trolley problem, right? How do you program a car to decide which accident is the better accident that it's going to have? It is a serious problem, and one of the reasons why I don't think we're going to have self-driving cars anytime soon, not because we can't solve the problem, but because insurance companies won't insure us for self-driving cars for liability reasons. And so for this reason, I wanted to just take a brief moment as a means of an introduction. Since Michael read passage of a book, I wanted to read a passage, the introductory passage of Larissa's book, Strangers Drowning, where she talks about it being a book about a human character who arouses conflicting emotions, the do-gooder. This person has a sense of duty that is very strong, so strong that he's able to repress most of his baser impulses in order to do what he believes to be right. The life of the zealous do-gooder is a kind of human sublime, by which I mean that although there is a hard beauty in it, the word beautiful doesn't capture the ambivalence it stirs. A beautiful object, a flower, a stream, is pleasing in a gentle way, inspiring a feeling that is like love. A sublime object, such as a mountain or a rough sea, inspires awe, but also dread. Confronting it, you see its formidable nobility, and at the same time, you sense uncomfortably that you would not survive in it for long. It is this sense of sublime that I mean to apply to do-gooders. To confront such a life is to feel awe mixed with unease. And this is the kind of attention she gives to the people that she writes about and she talks about. She doesn't expose them. She doesn't do gotcha journalism. What she does is show us how it is that their lives are enmeshed with the convictions and the beliefs that structure their actions and structure how it is that they wish to live and organize the world. In Strangers Drowning, she's talking about people who fly away and go to seem to us to shirk the responsibility of their families and their immediate environments in order to go and do good to other people. Today, I suspect she's going to be talking about the opposite impulse, the opposite conviction, which is not fly away and go somewhere else to do something good, but stay at home, and what it means to be to have the conviction of staying at home and having the belief to be enamored with the world in which you are living in the immediate time. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Larissa MacFarquhar, who will give us her lecture today. And then I believe that there will be possibility for questions afterwards. Thank you very much.
Hi. Should I speak into this or to? Okay. Both. Okay. Hello. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Michael and Davide, for that introduction, and Davide for restraining yourself and not saying how long we've known each other, which is an unsettling number. So Davide's right that this project that I'm in the middle of now is in some sense a response to the people I was meeting in Strangers Drowning, to go in the opposite direction and look at the attachment to home. And over the past couple of years, I've been talking with people about one of their most fundamental decisions, which we all have to make, which is whether to settle down where you grow up, near your family, or leave your hometown and move away. And of course, everyone has to decide how to live their life, but how to live your life is composed of 100 different decisions that you can constantly revise, and there's a new one every minute. But deciding where to live your life is another very basic human choice, but it's one that's much harder to unravel. It's also one that's often made when you're a teenager and aren't really thinking about what might happen in your family over the next 40 or 50 years. For this reason, I've found that these conversations I've been having can make people a little anxious, a little regretful, particularly if they have a brother or sister who's made a different choice. So if it has that effect on you, I apologize. But I'm going to start by telling you the story of a woman who isn't ambivalent at all about her choice. Her name is Mildred Calhoun. She grew up in a town called Eufaula, a small town in Alabama, right on the border with Georgia. And she graduated in the last class of her town's segregated black high school before the town's schools were forced to integrate. She was the class of 1967. And she said to me, when I left high school, I knew I would never come back to Eufaula. I knew at 12 that I would be a chef and have my own restaurant, and it would not be the kind of restaurant that Eufaula would support. It was a proud day for my mom when I walked off to college, but I had this little switch in my walk, and she said, "Don't walk like that." Why was Mildred so determined to leave? She said, there was no lifestyle in Eufaula. Plus, I grew up with George Wallace. It was so segregated. There were all these beautiful mansions, and we weren't allowed to go into the mansions. They were not mansions that people lived in, but historic mansions that people visited. And I said, one day I'm going to be Miss America. She went off to college. She married a military man and moved with him to a base in England, but he was violent, and she divorced him and moved to Northern California. She did open a restaurant there. It was called Cafe Something Special by Mildred, but she worked so hard to make a success of it that she ended up having a major stroke at 42. But she doesn't regret it. She said, I worked myself to death. I did, but that was my dream, and it was a wonderful dream. The other thing she wanted to do in her life was travel, and she did that too. She said, I always said, Lord, let me travel, and I have been to every state in the United States of America. It took me 10 years to complete. I couldn't just drive through the state. I had to spend the night, get a city tour, and eat the food of the culture. I have also been all over the world. I went to Israel, and my husband and I renewed our vows in the Church of Canaan and were baptized in the River Jordan. Her younger sister, Betty, grew up in the same house in the same town, but she experienced it all quite differently, and she felt no great urge to get away. I didn't feel as strongly as Mildred about Eufaula, Betty said. It affected her more. I saw what was going on, but it didn't get to me, the racism and the unjust things. I'm more carefree. I'm not as sensitive. I'm kind of like, we can get through this. We can get over this. It's not that serious. But it wasn't only racism that drove Mildred out. She wanted more of everything. Mildred thinks about the things she did not have, but I'm thankful for what I did have, Betty says. She's always wanted the finer things. I would say, why are you so upset because you can't have this or that? Mama's doing the best she can. Well, Mildred did not think so. Mildred's story is a story you've heard before. You've heard it before because it's the iconic American story. In other parts of the world, the normal thing to do is to stay where you grow up. people are ambivalent about mobility because leaving can be a kind of betrayal. It can be a kind of divorce. It weakens communities and families. But America was formed by the romance of the frontier and populated mostly by people who had already left somewhere else. And here, leaving home has always been the celebrated story, the bold, enterprising, properly American response to a bad life at home. And many of course, the iconic American stories are about journeys away from home. Moby Dick, Huckleberry Finn, On the Road, any number of Westerns. America's founding sense of itself is deeply tied to freedom of movement. There is, Thomas Jefferson wrote, a right which nature has given to all men of departing from the country in which chance, not choice, has placed them, of going in quest of new habitations. As the historian Greg Grandin writes in his new book, The End of the myth he's referring to is the myth of the frontier, quote, all nations have borders, and many today even have walls, but only the United States has had a frontier, or at least a frontier that has served as a proxy for liberation. Even decades before its founders won their independence, America was thought of as a process of endless becoming. According to this romance of the frontier, the dominant American story about mobility, it's the dynamic, smart, ambitious people who get up and go, the ones like Mildred. And of course, that is often true. It's not just the desire to make it big and see the world, though, that propels people away. There's another story, too, and I'll tell you another story of somebody who left. Dan Vermeer grew up in a small town in western Iowa called Orange City. He wanted to figure out who he was, and he needed to leave home in order to do it. In high school, he couldn't wait to get out. He had always felt a kind of moral claustrophobia in the town. He hated the constant scrutiny and the gossip and everyone knowing everybody's business. But that really wasn't why he wanted to leave. He wanted to leave because he felt wedged in. He said, you are who you are. I am a Vermeer, a child of Wally and Joanne, the younger brother of Greg, Brent, and Barry. And in Orange City, that's who I am for the rest of my life. It's not that I felt discriminated against. I felt known and loved. But I also felt that that was nowhere near all of me. And to know who I was, I had to define myself on my own terms. In college, he took classes in world religions, and the thought occurred to him that he believed what he believed simply because of where he was born. I had this incredible sense of vertigo, he said, where I didn't know what I believed about anything. That was really hard for about 6 months. But after I got through the crisis, I had a sense of exhilaration. I felt that anything was possible, that I could put together a worldview that was truly mine. After he graduated, he got a mission assignment at a Christian crisis center in Kathmandu, Nepal. The crisis center was very busy. There was a man from Turkey who'd heard there were jobs in Hong Kong and decided to walk there and got as far as Nepal and then ran out of money. There was a young woman who'd had a psychotic break on the side of a mountain and tried to jump off after taking off all her clothes. After 6 months in Kathmandu, he bought a ticket to Delhi, and he found a bed in a cheap tourist camp. It was so hot there that he couldn't sleep, and for 10 days he walked around in the crippling heat in a kind of existential confusion. He realized that he had no idea at all what he was going to do with his life. He had no plans, and the nearest person he knew was 7,000 miles away. He felt intensely anxious, but also hopeful. He realized that he had spent the first 18 years of his life becoming his Orange City self, and the next 5 years peeling off that self and letting it die. He had traveled halfway around the world to slough off the last of it. Now he could start again. So these are two quintessential stories of leaving. You have to leave in order to find out who you are, to escape family and history and invent a life for yourself that is entirely your own. You leave because you want something more, something bigger, or maybe just something new. For hundreds of years, this has been the dominant American story. But now America is changing. For a long time, Americans were the most mobile people on earth. But now they're not moving anywhere near as much as they used to. The number of people moving around the country is about half now what it was 40 years ago. In the mid-1950s, about 8% of unemployed men moved across state lines. And in 2012, 2.5% did. This trend is even more pronounced among African Americans than it is among white people. During the period of the Great Migration from the First World War to the 1960s, 4 million African Americans migrated out of the South, about 40% of the region's 1940 population. But more recently, nearly 70% of African Americans were still living as adults in the county they were born in. The lure of getting on the road is fading. in 1983, and this is very alarming to me, in 1983, 70% of 17-year-olds had their driver's license, and now only 50% of 18-year-olds do. Probably not here, but in general. This decline in mobility is particularly striking because mobility is associated with higher education, and education levels have gone way up in this time period. And it might seem that place is not that important anymore because, of course, you can work many jobs remotely, and there's the internet, and it seems like they're the same chain restaurants and stores everywhere you go. The death of place has been announced many times when the telephone, the TV, car, the plane, social media, all these things were supposed to make place not matter anymore. But in fact, it still very much does. There was a Gallup poll done a few years ago with 28,000 people that found that where you live is as important to your happiness as your job, your finances, and your relationships. For a long time now, the city has functioned as a kind of second American frontier, the place where you move, when you leave home. Even 150 years ago, for every industrial worker who moved out west to go farm, 20 farm boys moved to the city. But now the city is becoming closed off because the high cost of housing is pricing people out. It used to be that workers moved to follow jobs, as you would think. But now, actually, many of the people who do move, they're more likely to move to somewhere where unemployment is higher and wages are lower because housing is cheap. In 1890, the superintendent of the census announced the closing of the original American frontier because there was so much settlement, even all the way west, that it could no longer meaningfully existed. And 3 years after that, in 1893, the historian Frederick Jackson Turner argued that this closing of the frontier marked the end of the first era of American history, which was defined by the colonization of the West. He argued that it was this movement west and the hard confrontation with the difficult conditions there, he didn't like to focus on the part about killing the people who were there already, that had formed the unique American character, the stalwart and rugged qualities of the frontiersman, his independence and individualism, the buoyancy and exuberance which comes with freedom, and his disdain for the comforts, refinements, hierarchies, authorities, restraints, and taxes of the East, all of which represented the bondage of the past. And as he shucked off all this old world baggage, Turner believed, the American would also shuck off the attitudes that went with it, deference to employers and their social betters, and even provincialism and racism, he thought would disappear. But if the frontier no longer existed, then what would happen to the American character? I think what we're seeing now, as Americans stop moving around, as they have done for 200-300 years, is in effect a second closing of the American frontier. And this new development, this decline in mobility, which is very, very extreme, has set off many sounds of alarm, particularly among economists. They wonder, why aren't people setting off to find work and better their lives as they did in the past? If people become less willing to move for work, then unemployment will persist in some places, jobs will go unfilled in others. And it was because Americans used to move for work that for 100 years after 1880, regional inequality grew less and less, and states grew more and more similar in terms of their economies, and now regional inequality is rising again because people are not moving. The economist Tyler Cowen wrote a book called The Complacent Class, in which he argued that this decline in mobility is a part of an insidious new complacency. He thinks that it portends a society which lacks creative ferment and innovation, and that we may be in cultural decline, losing our mojo. Raj Chetty, a Harvard economist, has been conducting a long-term study, the Moving to Opportunity study, which you may have read about, in which he tries to persuade families to move to a better neighborhood because that has been proven to make an enormous difference in the lives, particularly of very young children. But he's found that even giving people money to offset the cost of the move and making up, the government supplies the difference in rent, so it doesn't cost them anything. More than half of the families he makes this offer to just say no. And Americans still believe that moving away from home is a good way to social mobility. They just don't want to do it. The economist Esther Duflo, who just won the Nobel Prize, last year she asked 5,000 Americans whether she thought people ought to move 200 miles away from where they lived in order to take a job. And 62% said, yes, absolutely they should. But when she asked 5,000 different people, would you move 2,000 miles away for a job? Only 52% said yes. And of people who are actually unemployed and therefore might actually face this decision, only 32% said yes. And this is assuming there is a job, something just waiting for you. And recently it's become also clear that this is not just an economic situation, it has political implications as well. There's a phrase that's often used to describe Trump voters, left behind. And because suspicion of those who move around, immigrants, refugees, globalized elites, is associated with voting for Trump, attachment to home has come to look like a Trumpian value. And it does seem that immobility correlates strongly with support for the president. There was a poll conducted in the summer of 2016 which found that of white people who still live in their childhood hometown, 60% voted for Trump. Of those who live within a 2-hour drive of their hometown, 50%. And those who live more than 2 hours away, 40%. So that's a very strong political predictor. Greg Grandin, again, has argued that it is Trump's talk of building a wall which marks the end of America's frontier myth, because it conveys the message that we no longer believe there's enough wealth and space in America for everybody. And I think he's right that the wall is a potent symbol of scarcity and limits. But I think what's also new about this moment, this sense of limits, geographical and otherwise, is that it's not just this sense that there is nowhere necessarily that's better to go, and so you might as well stay where you are. This sense is not just a matter of political rhetoric, but is affecting in a big way how people make the foundational choices of their lives. So I set out to find out who are these people who are staying, who are deciding not to leave, but to stay home instead. Because we don't hear as much about them. They are not the iconic American story. And those who leave often regard those people who stay with contempt, assuming that they stay because they're stuck, that they're too inert, small-minded, or insufficiently educated to do anything else. And this assumption leads to the further impression that the people who stay are a kind of permanent inbred group, the ones who didn't move when they should have, when the farms got bought up, or the boll weevil arrived, or the mines closed, or the factories moved abroad. And of course, some people do stay because they're fearful, or because they're stuck at home for practical reasons. Maybe their mortgage is underwater, or they have a child with an ex and they can't leave. But on the other hand, some people are very happy with their home. They love the place, they want to stay close to their families, and if their lives more or less replicate those of their parents, they're fine with that. I met in the same town that Dan Vermeer in western Iowa, where he grew up, I met a woman named Stephanie Schwebach, who grew up in the same town, but she never felt restless as he did. She didn't mind that everyone would always see her as the child of her parents, because that's how she thought of herself. She met her future husband, Eric, in 6th grade. Her professional goal was to get a job teaching in the same school that she went to as a child. She said, I really don't have an adventurous spirit. I'm going to stay with the people I know. Stephanie and Eric now live in the house that Eric grew up in, next door to Eric's parents, and a short walk from hers. When she thought about what she wanted for her children in the future, she said, stay close. She said, I want them to live right next door so I can be the grandma that takes care of their kids. Both our kids have told us that once Eric's folks are dead, we have to buy their house so that they, our kids, can move into our house next door, and that would be fine with me. The interesting thing is there are a lot of people like Stephanie in Orange City, and it's worth noting that it's because of that the town is actually thriving, unlike so many small rural places. And this is a town without natural advantages. It's in the middle of nowhere. It's very hard to get to. It only just got a 4-lane highway very recently. So it's very inconvenient, and the weather is horrible. But because of people like Stephanie being attached to their families, sometimes a lack of mobility leads not to less prosperity, but to more. So in most Iowa towns, and there's been a lot written about this, and as Iowa is especially vulnerable to this, in most Iowa towns, the ambitious parents tell their children to go as far as they can, and if that requires moving far away, literally, go do that. As a result, the towns are drained of their most capable and ambitious kids, and the town begins to die. In Orange City, partly because it's a very conservative, very religious place, and it's kind of suspicious of the morals of other places, Parents tend not to tell that to their kids. They tend to say that it's more important, rather than career is not as important as family. Stay here. It's a nice Christian place. We'll help you raise your children. This is a good place to live. And as a result, many of the smart, ambitious kids do stay, and they found businesses, and the town is doing really well. So paradoxically, it's because this town cares less about prosperity than some other places that it has become extremely prosperous. There's a sense in America that things are going well. You can tell when things are going well if the lives of the younger generation look very different, better than those of their parents. But for people like Stephanie Schwebach, their lives are more likely to be cyclical, and they're fine with that. Your parents took care of you, now you take care of them. They had kids, now you have kids. Your parents move out of the house they raised you in, and you move into it. And a lot of the jobs are cyclical also. Teachers educating children to be teachers, medical workers managing cycles of birth and sickness and death. Frederick Jackson Turner described the frontier as a place of perennial rebirth, which is to say it's a place where you can imagine that you gave birth to yourself with no help from place or parents. But to stay in your hometown is to accept that you have not given birth to yourself, that you are part of something larger, something that began before you were born and will continue after you're dead. And in fact, staying for some people can be a choice to reject choosing altogether, to embrace the life they were born into, not because it's better than another life, but because it's theirs. I recently read a book called The Shepherd's Life by James Rebanks, whose family has kept sheep in this one small hilly area in the north of England for hundreds and possibly thousands of years. And he actually, for the first person in his family to get a college degree, he went to Oxford. But he ended up back in his home village working as a shepherd again. He chose, as he saw it, not to choose at all. Some people's lives are entirely their own creation, he wrote. Mine isn't. He rejects the idea of life as an individual's project, imagined and shaped out of nowhere like a novel, driven by a desire for significance. He embraces instead being part of a people defined by continuity and anonymity, generation after generation of, as he puts it, nobodies, doing the same thing in the same place. There is no beginning and no end, he writes. The farms and the flocks endure, bigger than the life of a single person. There is nothing chosen about it. I love this place. For me, it is the beginning and the end of everything, and everywhere else feels like nowhere. But not everyone is at peace with staying, as James Rebanks and Stephanie Schwebach are. Many other people return home but are embarrassed about it. They feel that by living where they grew up, they've somehow failed to separate from their parents or to wrestle with the bigness and difficulty of life. There are a lot of personal essays online by people who've stayed in their hometown or moved back. I've read hundreds of them. And the predominant emotion in these essays is shame. I'll read you just a few quotes. I was supposed to be out of here by now. I don't loathe living here, but I feel like I failed. I always judged my mom, who spent her entire life here, for seemingly never wanting to get out. I try not to think about the fact that I'm one of those people who still lives in their hometown, that I'm the pathetic, aimless stereotype, that I'm almost 30 and still live 10 minutes away from my dad. Another quote. I was determined to escape because the last thing I wanted was to be stuck in my farm town in Colorado like everybody else. I felt like moving back home would mean that I became nothing, that I was nothing. And a third. I wanted to go home, but I felt embarrassed to tell people. I couldn't shake this nagging feeling that I'd failed. I didn't want to be one of those guys, those sad guys who still goes to all his high school football teams' Friday night games, even in his 50s. 50s. As so often, this feeling was perfectly captured by an article in The Onion. The headline, "Unambitious loser with happy, fulfilling life still lives in hometown." I'll read you just a little bit. The whole thing is fantastic. Longtime acquaintances confirmed to reporters this week that local man Michael Husmer, an unambitious 29-year-old loser who leads an enjoyable and fulfilling life, still lives in his hometown and has no desire to leave. Sources close to Husmer reported that the man who has meaningful, lasting personal relationships and a healthy work-life balance and is able to afford a comfortable lifestyle without going into debt is an unmotivated washout. I honestly don't get Mike. Does he even want to get out of that backwater town and make something of himself, or does he just want to waste his time enjoying his existence? High school friend Caitlin Cece said. Everyone else left as soon as possible and is consumed by a deep sense of apprehension about getting ahead. But it's almost like he's saying, I just want to be an emotionally stable husband and father who's not obsessed with climbing the corporate ladder and impressing complete strangers with my job title. Cece added, pathetic. It's one of the distinctive, I realized reading a lot of these essays that it's one of the distinctive things about American mobility that often when you move for the sake of ambition, you're not going somewhere better. You're actually going somewhere worse, at least initially, and at least in terms of material comfort. This was true of the frontier for sure, and it's still often true of people moving to cities because they're expensive and the traffic is terrible. But dyed-in-the-wool leavers embrace this as a kind of badge of honor. The glamour of leaving is such that people feel that they're doing something cool just by surviving in the city, even if in fact they're not doing anything very cool at all. I met a young woman recently called Bryn Durgan who grew up in a tiny town, like 1,000 people in upstate New York, and she moved to New York City after college. Then when she was 27, her father was diagnosed with dementia, and there were no caregiving resources anywhere near the town. And so Bryn moved home at 27 to take care of him. And for 3 years, she took care of him all day, every day. At the same time, she set about trying to make things better for other people in her situation. She raised money for the Alzheimer's Society. She founded a memory cafe in town, and she persuaded the owner of a defunct grocery store to let her turn it into a community center. In the years she lived in New York City, on the other hand, she worked in human resources at a cupcake company, and she worked as a dog walker for rich people. But in her town, it was her time in the city that made her glamorous. So people stay home or move home for a lot of reasons. Some people like Stephanie stay home because they love it. Other people like Bryn move home because their family needs them. But some people stay home to shake things up. They realize that their hometown needs them in a way that a city doesn't. A couple years ago, I met a man called Michael Klein, who owns Hot Cup, which is a coffee shop filled with superhero figurines in a tiny town in Logan. I keep saying tiny, but they really are under 1,000 people. Seems to me very small. A tiny town in southern West Virginia. And he said to me, "It's always my favorite compliment. People don't think I'm from around here because I speak in words of more than 3 syllables." And I said, "Well, if you hate this town," and he really hates it, "why don't you move?" And he said, "I got this question just the other day. Why not move to Charlotte, North Carolina, a much more progressive, beautiful place, or move out to San Francisco where there's a coffee shop every 4th block?" And I said, "Those places don't need me. They have dozens of me. This town needs me. Case in point, I was walking back to the kitchen the other day through my nerd cave, and there were these 2 high school girls just leaning in for a kiss. And when they saw me, they jerked back and they said, 'Oh, please don't tell our dads.' And I said, 'Trust me, you're in the one place where no one's going to tell your dads.' I feel like we're fighting the good fight here. Every place needs that one sanctuary. Every redneck town should have one little liberal coffee shop where those kids who hate their Trump parents can come and talk it out." Contrary to popular belief, it is not just conventional people who decide to stay in their hometowns, but often it's also those who are deeply unconventional. Because they're unconventional, they can resist, or they don't even feel, the shame of moving home or staying at home, which makes them free to live somewhere cheap so they can be their own boss and do what they want to do. In places where rents are low, you don't have to have a high-paying day job. You might be an inventor or an artist or start your own coffee shop. You might start a stand-up comedy night, because if you live in a small place, you can't just go out for entertainment because there isn't that much around, and so you have to make your own entertainment. The urban theorist Richard Florida talks about a creative class of people who live in urban hipster neighborhoods in what he calls superstar cities in order to partake of their creative their food and their cultural offerings. But most of the creative class that Richard Florida talks about are creative mostly in the sense that they consume culture as well as material stuff. Many actual artists, as we know, can't afford superstar cities. Most people who decide to stay or move home don't do it primarily in order to change things. They go back for personal reasons, because they're homesick or because their family needs them. But once they're there, they often find themselves changing things anyway because they don't want to leave, but they want a different way of life. Samuel Alameda grew up in Eufaula, the same Alabama town that Mildred Calhoun, the first woman I spoke about, grew up in, but he's a generation later. He is now in his early 30s, and he is from a well-to-do white family. And he knew from when he was 4 years old that he was different, and when he got older, he figured out that it was because he was gay. So when he realized this, he was like, okay, I'm definitely going to have to leave. I can't live in a small southern town. And this was his plan throughout his teenage years. But then in high school, as he neared the end of high school, someone saw him kissing a boy, and he ended up coming out to his friends and family before he wanted to. And it turned out that nobody seemed to think it was a big deal after all. So he realized he could stay if he wanted to, but he'd been thinking about leaving for so long that he decided to do it anyway. He went to school in Boston, and he loved how big it was and how many different sorts of people you could meet there and how many things there were to do. But he hated the winters, and he couldn't get used to how unfriendly people were. He said, "One day I was standing on the sidewalk waiting for the light to change, and this woman in a suit, we were standing next to each other for like 30 seconds, and I was like, 'Hey, how are you today?' And she literally clutched her purse and took 2 steps away from me." I was telling people about it afterwards, and they were like, "People up here do not like that. Don't be so friendly." And he was like, "I'm the problem?" He moved to Texas a few years after that, but then his sister, whom he was very close to, had a baby. He said to me, "I would come back for holidays, and 6 months would have passed, and the baby was suddenly 2, and I started thinking she's going to be 10 tomorrow and 18 the next day, and I want to be the uncle she remembers, not the uncle she was told about." So he decided to move back to Eufaula. But he moved back for another reason as well. He says, "Everybody at this point has heard of gay people. They see gay people on TV, but there's still many people in the South who have never met a gay person or think they haven't. And because I'm a likable, friendly person, I look at that as an opportunity for me. I don't go out to teach people about queer people, but I want to be that person who everyone can say, I know a gay person, I have a gay friend, and hopefully that will shift their thinking when gay issues come out in politics. Because it won't be abstract, they'll think of their friend Sam. I'm well known around here, and I have zero time for apologizing for being queer. I'm queer at my house, I'm queer at a restaurant, I'm queer at church, and I'm always talking about it and joking about it. And so I've had more than a few people take me aside and say, I was overhearing, and actually I'm gay or bi or trans. I started meeting all these other people in town, and once I realized that there was a larger group than that any of us were aware of, I started to organize an LGBTQ social group, and we meet up once a month to have dinner. So Sam Lemater tries to change his town by being very friendly. Another woman I met, Diane Arneth, her approach is a bit different. She grew up on the South Shore of Staten Island, which, as you know, is part of New York City, but it's very, very different from most of the city. It's extremely conservative. It's almost 100% white. And in 2016, it went for Trump by an enormous margin. And her family was religious Catholic, and when she was a child in the late 60s, her mother sent her to what she thought was a strict Catholic girls' school. Unbeknownst to her mother, however, the nuns who taught in the school were very radical, and they turned Diane on to the anti-war movement and the social justice, and before long she was hanging out with Black Panthers at the north end of Staten Island near the ferry, which was not the plan. Now, she was already in New York City. All she needed to do was to drive for 10 minutes across the Verrazano Bridge, and she would be in Brooklyn among thousands of people who thought just like she did. But she didn't do that. She thought, if I leave, who's going to yell at these people? So she stayed. She worked as a director of group homes for teenagers, but got fired for offering family planning, even though it was required by law. She sued the archdiocese and won. She taught about gay sex in a school, and the school board held a meeting in protest. In the early 80s, she started an AIDS task force and advocated for opening a needle exchange program. This time she got death threats, and she was forbidden to do it. But she fought and fought and fought, and finally in 2009, she won. She said to me, "You can't win by just talking to yourselves. Change happens only because people yell and scream and jump on tables. If the community I live in doesn't hold a lot of the values that I do, I'll be damned if I just leave them behind, because you can just be a much more powerful argument against it if you're of that community. If I left, my voice would leave with me." For people like Diane Arneth, in other words, the flaws of their hometown are not a reason to leave, but a reason to stay. Some people try to change their hometowns because they're attached to them, but other people are attached to their hometowns because they can change them in a way that they wouldn't be able to in a place where they didn't deeply know people. So these 3 stories were of individuals, but there are also much larger epic stories of people going home and changing things, but they're just not told very often. So for instance, this was news to me when I was doing research for this book. I discovered that at the height of European immigration to the US between 1880 and 1930, there were many people who returned home. Of all the millions of immigrants who came here, about a third of them, 4 million people, went back. They went back for the same reasons that most people go back, because they were homesick, or they were patriotic, or they had to take care of aging parents, or take over the family farm, or because they'd made the money they came to make, or they disliked America. But when they came back from America, when they went home, they weren't the same as they'd been when they left. They talked back to their betters. They washed very often. They left their old churches and joined new ones. They started schools and mutual aid societies. They had become ambitious. Now they weren't just trying to survive. They were trying to make their situation better. And they advocated for higher wages. They bought land. They went into politics and organized unions and political parties. There was actually 3 returnees from America became prime ministers of Norway, Finland, and Latvia. And Garibaldi, the general who in the 1860s helped to unify Italy, once lived on Staten Island and worked on Bleecker Street. I didn't know that. But it wasn't only the returnees that were changing things. There were also people who stayed in Europe who changed things as well. Interestingly, during that same period, the 1880 to 1930, when so many Europeans were emigrating to America, Italians who lived in regions where there was a lot of militant organizing, a lot of unions and syndicalists and anarchists and strikes, those people tended to stay because it seemed like there was a chance to change things. But in other regions where there wasn't a lot of organizing and strikes were prohibited and there didn't seem to be anything to do, those people left. So in other words, staying did not mean staying the same, but leaving left a place as it was. Another example of one of these larger stories, a couple of generations later after these people, in the 1970s and 80s, about 500,000 African Americans, in a reversal of the Great Migration, moved back to the South from the North. And many of them didn't move to the New South, so-called Atlanta or Charlotte, but right back to the same rural places that they or their parents had come from. And those rural places in the 70s and 80s were not much better than they had been when they left. The anthropologist Carol Stack wrote about a few such families in a book called To Home. And she found that many of these people had made big sacrifices professionally. They went from working in offices and living in apartment buildings to living in trailers, and when they could find a job at all, they worked at places like poultry plants because that was what was there. But they had acquired confidence and aggression living in the cities, and they often took it as a mission to shake things up and change things where they were. And she wrote, "What people are seeking is not so much the home they left behind as a place that they feel they can change, a place in which their lives and strivings will make a difference, a place in which to create a home." It's because of people like this that statistics of Trump voters notwithstanding, the politics of mobility and home are complicated. A lot of research suggests that African Americans who moved north in the Great Migration were more ambitious and better educated than their relatives who stayed in the South. But the civil rights movement did not happen in the North. It started in the South, among people who didn't want to leave, people who, for various reasons, felt compelled to stay in spite of everything. David Frost is one of these people. David Frost was a black farmer and a moonshiner who was, again, born in Eufaula, the same town in Alabama. He was a generation earlier than Mildred. He was born in 1917. And he grew up with brutal lynchings taking place in his town, including one a mile away from his house, at his cousin's house. And all his brothers left town as soon as they could. They moved north to Cincinnati, and they worked in factories, and they made very good money. And they kept writing to him, begging him to get out of Eufaula before something bad happened. And at one point, he did move to Cincinnati to join them, but he lasted just a month, and then he went back. He hated living in the city slums rather than on his own land, and he hated working for somebody else. Making moonshine was dangerous, and it wasn't particularly profitable, but at least he was his own boss in his own place. He got constantly in trouble because of his moonshining business, but he also became a political troublemaker. In the late 40s, despite death threats, he joined the NAACP, he registered to vote, and he tried to get other people to register to vote too. He ended up in prison. And while he was in prison, it occurred to him that maybe when he got released, he really should get out of Eufaula before he got himself killed. But then he heard that the judge in his case, who was Jack Wallace, who was George Wallace's brother, was trying to prevent him from returning to town. And that annoyed him. And so when he got out of prison, he went right back home. And I started wondering when I was thinking about his story, what if there had been many more people like David Frost? In other words, what if the Great Migration had not happened at the scale that it did? What would this country look like now? The Great Migration acted as a kind of safety valve in two ways, offering, obviously, safety to people whose lives were in danger, but often also siphoning off many of the people who were most discontented from the South. If more of those people had been able to stay, if so many had not been forced to flee for their lives, might the civil rights movement have happened sooner? Carlton Turner, an activist and artist who lives in his hometown in southern Mississippi, is the son of the only member of his parents' generation who did not leave in the Great Migration, who stayed in the South. Everybody else left. And he has thought a lot about this as a result, like, why did my parents stay and everyone else left? And he pointed out to me that blacks outnumbered whites in Mississippi until the 1940 census. That's when the population tipped from 51% black to 49%, and it kept on diminishing from there. Now in 2019, it's 37% black and 59% white. Had the Great Migration not taken place, he said, Mississippi would be a majority black state, as would Alabama, Arkansas, and Louisiana. He often thinks about how the electoral and racial power dynamics would be different in the South and in the entire country if so many African Americans had not left. For more than 200 years, people have described migration as a safety valve, encouraging the most aggressive and discontented people to leave rather than stay home and cause trouble. Even in the Federalist Papers, James Madison argued that an ever-expanding republic, a moving frontier, would make factions and conflict less likely, because if people were always moving on somewhere else, they would be unlikely to share common interest or passion, or discover their own strength and act in unison with each other. Mobility, in other words, can sometimes act as an alternative to change. In his 1970 book, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, the economist Albert Hirschman described different ways of expressing discontent. You can exit, stop buying a product, or leave town, or you can use voice. You can complain to the manufacturer, or you can try and stay and try to change the place you live in. The easier it is to exit, he wrote, the less likely it is that a problem will be fixed. Americans, he wrote, have always preferred the neatness of exit over the messiness and heartbreak of voice. Discontented Europeans staged revolutions. Americans just left. He wrote, the curious conformism of Americans, noted by observers ever since Tocqueville, may also be explained in this fashion. Why raise your voice in contradiction and get yourself in trouble, as long as you can always just remove yourself entirely from any given environment, should it become too unpleasant? If everyone who is dissatisfied with the way things are just leaves, it's unlikely that anything will be fixed. But if people are so attached to their home that they feel obliged to stay and fight, there's a chance that things will change. Feeling stuck or trapped, in other words, is not always a bad thing because it leads to a buildup of political pressure. I was watching Frank Capra's It's a Wonderful Life the other day, and I realized that It's a Wonderful Life is basically Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, the movie. For the two of you who haven't seen it, you might imagine that it's a celebration of how great small towns are, but it really is not. George Bailey, the Jimmy Stewart character, doesn't love his hometown. He actually hates it. When his father asks him to stay and take over the family's building and loan, which is enabling the town's poor to live in decent houses, he says, gee, Pop, I couldn't face being cooped up for the rest of my life in a shabby little office. I'd go crazy. I want something big, something important. George is a hero because he stays in his hometown despite feeling desperately trapped there. But he also learns that feeling trapped is not entirely a bad thing because everyone is trapped together. The structure of the building and loan is such, as George says, when there's a run on the building and loan and everyone wants to cash in their money, he says, your money isn't here. It's in Joe's house and in Kenny's house and the Macklins and 100 others. You lent them the money to build and they're paying you back as best they can. He explains that if everyone goes it alone and lets the evil banker buy out their loans, everyone will be worse off. But as long as they accept being trapped together, things will improve. There is, Hirschman wrote, a kind of power and influence that come with having nowhere else to go. So there are then two possible stories about the politics of American mobility, two kinds of politics that can arise out of this closing of the frontier moment that we're in at the moment. The pressure that comes from feeling trapped in a limited zero-sum world can be directed outward at immigrants and refugees, but it doesn't have to be. It can also be directed inward at power structures. The American frontier was a promise of limitless prosperity, a promise that one person's wealth did not have to come at the expense of another's. And the lure of this promise helped to calm political dissent for a long time. It encouraged people to set off on their own rather than staying to fight. For this reason, for at least 100 years, people on the left have criticized the myth of the frontier and endless mobility as deeply pernicious. In 1912, Walter Weil, a socialist and an editor of the New Republic, saw the individualistic frontier mentality as a pathology that would now that the frontier no longer existed, would happily be corrected. He wrote, "The westward march of the pioneer gave to Americans a psychological twist which was to hinder the development of a socialized democracy. The open continent intoxicated the American. It gave him an enlarged view of self. It dwarfed the common spirit. It made the American mind a little sovereignty of its own, acknowledging no allegiances and but few obligations. It created an individualism, self-confident, short-sighted, lawless, doomed in the end to defeat itself, as the boundless opportunism which it gave birth to became at last circumscribed." There are two kinds of lives that everyone chooses between, to stay or to go, to leave in search of some kind of frontier, throwing off the limits of your upbringing, or to stay or return home and embrace that place as your own. And both these lives are necessary. I think it's strange that so many people feel embarrassed to return home because the classic hero story is about going away, but coming back again. If you don't come back home, you're not a hero. You're an emigre. And I think it's unfortunate that in America, choosing this second kind of life is so embarrassing and can look to many people like a failure to choose at all. But I think that since so many Americans, by not leaving, by not being mobile as they used to be, are choosing that second kind of life, that too may change. Thank you.